welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming and participating in this session. It's based on an 88-page paper, and it's always difficult to summarize an 88-pager in a very quick presentation, but that's what I'll attempt to do, and really recommend that you go to the website and download the full paper and read it at your leisure. My plan for today is to talk a little bit about the pace and scope of change, the changing powers and roles in the immigration process, policy and program changes, the cumulative impact, and to end up with what I think Canada actually needs. So in terms of the pace and scope of change, first of all, I've been involved in the immigration business for a very long time, I think since 1979. And in that period of time, I have never seen so much change introduced so quickly ever before. It's unprecedented. It does leave one fairly breathless. We have chosen to focus specifically on the period from 2008 to July 1st, 2012. There have been changes even since then, but we have to stop somewhere. But we're looking particularly at that period. And the changes affect absolutely every aspect of immigration policy and immigration programs. The changes also affect the process for immigration reform, how those changes have been introduced to date, and the ability to change them in future. The changes also affect the powers and the roles of all the various players and stakeholders in the immigration process. And I also believe that there has been a real change in terms of the discourse on immigration. All of these changes have their potential individual impacts. What I also look at, perhaps equally importantly, is not just the individual impact, but the cumulative impact of all those changes and how they are shaping the future of Canada. We all know that decisions made today in immigration policy will affect Canada for generations to come. This is a graphic that basically shows all the areas of change that have happened in this time period. I'll refer to the boxes in sort of as a clock, but at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 11 o'clock, those are the three classes of permanent residents coming to Canada, and there have been significant changes. I'll highlight some of them during this presentation. But there have been significant changes in all ways that people enter Canada on a permanent basis. There have also been significant changes to temporary entrants, and those are both temporary foreign workers and international students and visitors. There have been changes to the way citizenship is attained and who is eligible for citizenship and what criteria they have to meet. As I indicated before, real changes in terms of the powers and roles of the minister, in terms of federal-provincial relations, employers and educators, etc. Public engagement changes and the parliamentary process, consultation processes, and of course, settlement services. I'm not going to go through all of these during this presentation, but I will highlight some of them. In terms of the overall federal directions, I think this is basically a summary of the directional changes. First of all, every single class for permanent entry to Canada has been tightened or is in the process of being tightened. And again, that refers to economic class people, family class, as well as refugees. On the other hand, there has been a real facilitation of temporary entry to Canada, either as a foreign worker or as an international student. The government did introduce in 2008 opportunities for people who come here first as either temporary workers or as international students, for some of them, not all of them, to transition to permanent residence from within Canada. That was a real change. And that is a trend towards what I call two-step immigration. Rather than people coming here first as a permanent resident with all the rights incumbent upon a permanent resident, more and more people are coming here first as a temporary entrant and then transitioning to permanent residence from within Canada in a two-stage process. I will talk about some of those issues a little bit later on in the presentation. The fourth overall direction is that there are tougher rules for citizenship that people have to meet, and I'll go through some of those. And as I said, a real change in terms of the powers, particularly of the minister and roles of various players. And I'm going to talk about that last thing now first. So, changing powers and roles. In 2008, and I think this is a very significant change, as part of a budget bill that amended the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, for the first time the minister was given powers called ministerial instructions, where he or she can direct these officers and officers in Canada on basically every aspect of immigration. These were expanded even further in the 2012 budget bill. So as a result of these changes, the minister, on his or her own, without going through parliamentary processes, can make decisions about accelerating applications, about returning applications, imposing conditions. He can create new programs. He can retroactively apply instructions and change the rules of the game after people have already submitted their applications. He can establish classes, and he can do all of this for things pertaining to sponsorship, permanent and temporary applicants, work permits, and study permits. It's quite an extraordinary range of powers the minister now can implement on his or her own without parliamentary approval. In addition, as a result of the omnibus bill called C-31, the minister was given two additional powers. One, to designate countries that are unlikely to produce refugees, called designated countries of origin, and to deem some asylum seekers to be irregular arrivals, otherwise known as designated foreign nationals. In both these cases, the minister has the authority to do this, again, on his or her own, and without consultation of experts and without consultation of Parliament. I will talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on, but the designation process of those two, designated country or designated nationals results in very differential treatment of refugees, which in my view is problematic, and I will go through that a little bit later. In addition, in terms of changing powers and roles, we have seen the federal government in this period of time making a significant number of unilateral decisions that have strained federal-provincial relations. As you know, immigration is an area of shared jurisdiction with federal primacy. But the federal government has made decisions unilaterally that the provinces have not necessarily been happy about. So, for example, putting a cap on provincial nominee programs or requiring language requirements for some elements of the provincial nominees, putting on occupational lists as a screen for federally skilled workers that limits the number of applicants that can come to the country. And these occupational lists do not respond to regional needs across the country. Changing the rules in terms of international students, it puts more onus on the provinces to designate host institutions and to follow up on students. Taking back responsibility for settlement services from British Columbia and Manitoba after they had been devolved to them. Limiting the coverage of health for refugees and refugee claimants, which will put more onus on provincial governments, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go through all of these now, but there are a listing of these unilateral decisions that have strained relationships. And in addition, the last area here in terms of changing powers and roles is that the government, particularly as a result of two-step immigration, has provided the opportunity for employers and educational institutions to basically select who will ultimately become permanent residents and citizens in Canada. But they have not, at the same time, required employers or educational institutions to provide some of the settlement and integration services that these folks require, even though they are not eligible for federal services when they are temporary entrants to the country. Employers and educational institutions will select people that meet their needs and for their purposes, not necessarily in the best interest of the nation. The federal government has also now incorporated the use of third-party assessors to help in the selection process, particularly in terms of language assessment and in terms of educational credential assessment. So in terms of the actual, let me turn now to some of the policy and program changes, but let me look at this from 1,000 feet first. There's a real mix of policy and program changes. Some of them on the surface seem quite positive. For example, a real focus on federal skilled workers, which I think is a good thing. The introduction of a new trades program, which I think is also a very positive new addition. Others really seem quite problematic. For example, the different categories of refugee claimants and how they will be treated quite differentially, as well as a real increase in low-skilled temporary foreign workers as an example. But most of them, it really is too early to tell. We now have announcements in some cases. In other cases, we have the beginnings of implementation of these new changes. In some cases, we don't know yet what the implementation details will be, and we really do need to do some very close monitoring and evaluation to see whether these positive changes turn out to be really positive or may have some unintended consequences or may need some tweaking, and whether the ones that we are expecting to be problematic turn out to be less or even more problematic than we expect. Some of these changes are absolutely evidence-based, and I laud the government for using evaluation and for using some of the evidence in terms of making some of these changes. And for example, requiring, having a language requirement for some of the provincial nominees, I think is a good step in the direction of some national standards for provincial nominee programs. There is no evidence for others, in my opinion. We don't have evidence about how extensive marriage fraud is. We have no evidence on whether there really is a problem with birth tourism, as another example. And others, other changes seem counter to the evidence, whether here in this country or in other countries. So, for example, the mandatory detention of refugee claimants, which is introduced now as part of C-31, has not been affected in Australia. The occupation list for skilled workers, choosing people or having a screen based on occupation, is counter to CIC's own evaluation of the federal skilled worker program, which shows that choosing people on the basis of occupation rather than on the basis of adaptability and human capital is not a good way to go. So I'm going to go really quickly. I'm hoping that you will read the screens as we go through these, because I'm just going to highlight one or two of the points on each of these because I don't have time to go through them in detail. Basically, in the economics class, it will be harder to qualify in every category, whether it's a federal skilled worker program, provincial nominees, investors, entrepreneurs, etc. And maybe that will result in better short-term results. However, we have to be cautious. And some of the changes, for example, to the criteria for the federal skilled worker program, for the principal applicants of those programs, may have unintended consequences depending on what level is chosen or what implementation strategy is actually decided on. So, for example, putting a real, increasing the requirements for language standards is good in the sense that we know that language is the best predictor for labor market integration. But if it's too high, it may really drastically change the source countries. And we know, for example, that it will likely vary. Well, we know it'll have an impact on China, and we know that, for example, the second generation of Chinese immigrants do wonderfully well. We know that we want to have trade agreements with China. I'm not sure that putting into place a process that will reduce the numbers from that particular country is something that we really want to pursue. In terms of the age criteria, people who are 18 years old will get maximum points for age. We know that 18-year-olds here who have all kinds of things going for them are suffering from unemployment and having difficulties entering the labor market. I'm not sure that giving maximum points for 18-year-olds makes a whole lot of sense, et cetera. I'm going to stop there in terms of the economic class you can read on your screen. In terms of the family class, there are changes particularly to spouses and to parents and grandparents. One of the spousal changes is just a proposal at this point. It hasn't been approved, but it would require newly married spouses without children who join their spouse here in Canada to cohabit with their sponsored spouse for a 2-year period on a conditional status. We think that there are some real potential difficulties in that area, and it may keep people in relationships that are harmful because of the immigration conditionality, this conditionality of their status. With parents and grandparents, a super visa is not for visitors, is not a replacement for permanent residents, and it is out of reach for many parents and grandparents given the requirements for the sponsors to provide for complete medical coverage for individuals. The consultation questions that are online, or were online, I think the consultation is now closed, indicates that the government is considering tightening that program quite significantly. We don't know what direction they will actually take, but if they go in the direction of the consultation questions, it really will make it much more difficult to sponsor parents, and I think that will have real implications not only on the economic contributions that they can make by supporting their children and grandchildren, but it may restrict the number of skilled workers who actually want to come to this country if they cannot bring their families with them. In terms of refugees, the 3 categories of refugee claimants that have now been determined will result in very significantly different treatment. The most draconian will be for people who come as designated irregular arrivals, mandatory detention, 5-year waits, even after being declared a refugee by the Immigration and Refugee Board before they can apply for permanent residence or apply for their family members. Designated countries of origin, very problematic. The minister will make this determination without the benefit of expert advice on human rights issues in those home countries. Ministers of the Crown may be under other influence or other pressure in terms of trade relationships or whatever. Very problematic that the minister will make these decisions on his or her own. The time frames for the refugee determination process are likely going to be inadequate to ensure due process. And I would say again, as you have all followed, the limiting of the interim health program for refugees is very problematic. Citizenship, too, will be tightened, and it's being tightened, in my view, without any evidence for the need for these changes. A higher pass mark being required, more proof of language knowledge, even though the level of knowledge required is not being changed, the proof of language is being required. There is no evidence that people who became citizens in past are not good citizens or are not committed to this country. I don't understand why we are putting barriers in the way of people becoming citizens. Changes to the 2nd generation, or actually the 3rd generation, so that children born abroad will only be citizens if their parents were either born in Canada or naturalized in Canada. Given globalization now and the constant movement of people, that will limit citizenship to a wide variety of people, and I would think that it would be useful for Canada to have citizens and ambassadors of Canada all over the world, and Canada is now considering no automatic citizenship by birth because of this birth tourism fear, even though there is no evidence in that regard. So I think we will have fewer people becoming citizens in a longer time before they are eligible. That will mean that they are unable to vote. Their sense of belonging will diminish, and they live under fear of deportation. Let's move now to temporary foreign workers. The biggest issue here, as far as I'm concerned, is the significant increase in entries overall and the potential impact that has on domestic workers and on resource implications. This is overall. In 2010 and 2011, there were more temporary foreign workers in Canada than all permanent residents admitted to Canada combined. It tripled from 2002 to 2011. The government is now introducing accelerating labor market opinions and allowing employers to pay 50% less than the prevailing wage. All economists are saying that this will depress wages. Most importantly, I think there's been a significant increase in the low-skilled pilot, despite evidence both internationally and in Canada about the potential for exploitation and abuse and the fact that they don't leave, particularly given that there is no legal transition to permanent residency. This program has gone from approximately 1,300 people in 2002 to approximately 29,000 people in 2010, a 2,000% increase, probably the single most worrisome aspect of some of the changes. And there is very, very little enforcement of any new protections that have been announced but not enforced, and the whole process is complaint-based. In terms of the Canadian Experience class, this is the two-step process for immigration. It does allow for an easier transition, which I think is a good thing for some TFWs and for international students. But I really hope that two-step immigration does not become the norm. It is much better for people to arrive in Canada as full permanent residents with full rights, access to services, and on track for citizenship. I will leave that for now and go on. So really, let me turn to the cumulative impact, which I think all of these changes are reshaping the future of the nation. First of all, I'll go through highlights of these cumulative impacts. The first is I think that there's a real focus on short-term labor market gains as opposed to long-term nation building. Many of the changes focus on, and the minister says this very often, that he wants to get the best and brightest who can hit the ground running and make their contribution to Canada's labor market immediately. I think that going towards that objective as such a almost exclusive orientation of the immigration program is really quite problematic. It doesn't take into account the second generation of immigration to Canada and its success. It doesn't take into account the necessity for people to have skills that are adaptable to changing economies. It does not take into account the negative implications of an over-reliance on temporary foreign workers and the longer-term domestic implications both for workers already here in Canada and for those who are unemployed and underemployed, immigrant and non-immigrant alike. It's also true that people who are who come for a particular occupation at a particular point in time will leave the country if that occupation is no longer required here. We're looking to invite and encourage people to not only come to Canada but to stay in Canada, and we have to look at the data about who are the stayers and who are the leavers. A second big cumulative impact is in the whole area of the policies themselves, and I would argue that they lack policy coherence, they lack policy consistency, and they lack policy predictability. The coherence is a problem because a lot of these changes have been made piecemeal, program by program, stream by stream, without looking at the interaction of all the various streams of immigration. An example of lack of consistency is in the enforcement area, where there was a lot of enforcement, for example, to deport people more quickly, but very little enforcement to ensure that employers are actually honoring their commitments and their requirements for employment standards for their employees. And predictability, when you have caps and moratoria and sending back applications and changing ministerial instructions and implementing things retroactively, that does not indicate to the world at large stability or security or predictability, and I think will have an impact on how people perceive Canada. There is, well, I'll leave that for now. You can read on the screen, and there's much more on this in the paper. The third area is, I believe, a real weakening in the democratic process. And that is as a result of many of these changes being introduced by budget bills or omnibus legislation, not allowed for real discussion about some of these issues. The incredible increase in ministerial powers diminishes the role of Parliament, strained federal-provincial relations, and not recognizing the role of elected governments, limited or piecemeal consultation by either invitation only or on a particular stream or purely online, and the growing numbers of people who cannot vote or fully participate. There's also a concern about the lack of respect of our charter in terms of due process, in terms of treating people differently depending on what countries they come from, and whether we are honoring our international obligations in the human rights field, for example. I mean, mandatorily detaining 16-year-olds, one could question whether that meets our responsibilities under international law. All of this, I think, results in a less welcoming environment, both in terms of the tightened criteria that people will have to meet in all respects and some of the other areas that you can see on your screen. But I think the way this government has portrayed immigration more and more as part of its law and order agenda and with its enforcement focus changes the discourse. There are a series of mixed messages. On the one hand, we need immigration, we want immigration is something that the minister and the government say very frequently, but they use the words frequently like bogus refugees, marriage fraud, queue jumpers, taking advantage of Canada's generosity, citizenship fraud. And I think that that kind of discourse makes Canadians look at their neighbors a little bit differently, and I think that that is quite problematic. The world also judges countries, and potential immigrants judge potential countries of immigration by how they treat the most vulnerable among them. And I think many immigrants have come to Canada because of our reputation as a safe and secure environment for them and for their children and families. If we start getting a reputation of exploiting temporary foreign workers or denying health care to people who come to our shores or detaining 16-year-olds or treating refugees in a way that does not provide safety and security to them, it all results in making Canada a less attractive country of immigration, even though we need immigrants for our growth in this country. So on this slide, you see on the left-hand side those four areas that I've identified as the impact, and on the right-hand side, what I think Canada needs. And basically, what I'm saying is that it is really time for us to have a longer-term vision that looks at the future needs of the nation, not just our current needs. We need to use evidence-based policy that works together under a national vision. We need much more public engagement and parliamentary processes and meaningful provincial involvement. And we need to ensure that Canada remains a desirable country of destination. So I think it's time for a national conversation. And we need to involve everybody in this country to try to describe what kind of country we actually want to be, and how immigration policy, as only one tool in our toolkit, but an important tool in our toolkit, how can immigration policy help us get there? And what are the implications for current and future immigration policies? I think that discussion would be helped if it was based on certain principles, and these are the principles that I am putting forward. Again, that we focus on the long-term social and economic objectives and a commitment to citizenship, that we use an evidence-based approach and a comprehensive, fair approach that is respectful of human rights and our charter and international agreements, that we look at the interconnectedness between the various streams, that we develop our immigration policy through public and stakeholder engagement, through meaningful provincial, territorial, and federal consultation, and democratic processes that recognize the role of our parliament. And all of this, the principle should be that whatever we come up with should enhance Canada's reputation around the world. So in conclusion, last slide, I think that immigration policy is central to achieve our longer-term economic, demographic, and regional objectives. The decisions that we make today will shape the future of Canada for generations to come, and it's too important a policy area to be done quickly, piecemeal, without adequate evidence, without enough impact analysis, and without public debate. So perhaps we are trying to do too much too fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. We have now quite a nice amount of time for questions, and I'm going to encourage participants in the webinar to start formulating their questions. They don't have to be perfect, but as long as we can get a sense of the questions, it will help us get the discussion rolling. As Naomi said, we need a national conversation. Maybe this is the beginning of this national conversation. I'm going to kick off with the first question. Do you think, Naomi, that all these incremental changes have been made because there is a perception that the current system is broken?
There are certainly aspects of our immigration program that need fixing. I think that the fact that we had the backlogs that we had was a very serious problem. I'm not sure that the way the government has chosen to deal with the issue of backlogs by putting a moratorium on absolutely every single program, for example, was the best way to go. Canada has been seen as a model for immigration around the world for many, many years, and countries are still emulating our model. I'm not sure that us looking to Australia and New Zealand for changes, again, is the best way to go. Their systems are very different than ours. Their populations are different than ours, particularly New Zealand's. So I think there are a variety of things that the government could have done in a deliberate, comprehensive way, rather than in these piece by piece by piece by piece changes that ultimately, when you look at them all together, may have very serious unintended consequences.
A bit of a follow-up question, because the questions are piling up and we want to get to the audience. What about the absence of democratic processes and consultations in these changes?
Well, that's a very big issue as far as I'm concerned. I think that's one of the cumulative impacts, I think. The lack of respect for Parliament throughout these changes has been really quite disconcerting. Using budget bills to make very dramatic changes to individual pieces of legislation, using omnibus bills that don't allow for the fulsome kind of discussion of the bills. The consultations that the government has done some consultations, but they tend to be by invitation only. They tend to be on the individual pieces rather than on the vision as a whole. And when the online consultations are put on, the questions are quite leading, and the questions are quite restrictive. And I think that that's problematic. There really hasn't been an engagement with the public or with Parliament on some of the bigger questions that need to be asked and need to be addressed. And I think people need to be informed, people need to be involved, and people have to be committed to the directions in order for it to work.
So there's a question from Lisa Deacon about, how do we have this national conversation when some of the structures that enabled us to have it, such as Metropolis, are no longer available to us? How do we have this national conversation in a truly national way?
Well, I'm glad that Lisa brought up the Metropolis example, because I think one of the things that I'm going to backtrack for a moment, one of the important requirements for an informed public consultation is information, and is data, and is research, and is evidence, and is evaluation, rather than just have a discussion on the basis of, opinion that is not fact-based. The decision not to have the long-form census, the decision to cut Metropolis and the research that was funded through Metropolis, I think is really problematic. It will lead to less evidence that we need to inform a really good public consultation. So I think it's incumbent on people who are in the field, regardless of the fact that Metropolis is no longer around, to fund this kind of research. SSHRC still is. Other funding bodies still are. I really hope that CIC continues to do the evaluations and even expands those, because we need that kind of data. Now, the question of how do you have the public discussion is a really interesting question, and you can come at it from a variety of different ways. You can say that this should be government-led and either establish a commission or a task force, as governments have done in previous times, and there are real advantages to that kind of approach. One could also look at doing something very differently and perhaps having much more grassroots kinds of consultations with organizations across the country, initiating the conversation and building towards a national conversation, but starting at the ground first and building up. But I think that ultimately there has to be, it can't just be a million flowers across the country. There has to be some common basis for that discussion, and I thought that by putting out some principles might be the beginning of that conversation. I doubt that this particular government is going to issue a green paper. Other governments have. I wish that they would. I wish that they would, and not a white paper, but a green paper, which is really much more open-ended about, what objectives do you think we should be achieving, rather than getting right down into the nitty-gritty of program by program, to bring this up a few levels and really talk about our country and the future of our country.
Thank you, Naomi. We're going to switch gear to a question from Rupa Lembuyan, who makes an interesting point in the question. If you are aware of the gender analysis of these many changes, which will demonstrate the differential impact of these changes on women and children.
What a wonderful question. I am not aware of any third-party analysis that has been done on all these changes. Many of these changes are quite new. There have been gender-based analysis or gender analysis of individual aspects of immigration policy, but I don't know of anything that has really looked at it on a cumulative basis. The federal government does require a gender analysis of all their regulations. And if you go to the Gazette and look at the regulations that have been posted, there are some paragraphs that are devoted to analyzing the individual regulation changes on the basis of gender impact. Some of that is good analysis. Some may not be, deep enough in my opinion, but there is that requirement. The problem is, which I think is important to emphasize, that this is a requirement for regulation. It is not a requirement for ministerial instruction, because ministerial instruction now does not need to be done by regulation or by legislation or by, parliamentary discussion. So I'm not sure whether, if there is no requirement for the government to do that analysis, whether in fact it will be done. And I hope the people who do gender analysis at CIC will be taking that on, whether or not it is a requirement.
We certainly hope so. Naomi, two questions on temporary foreign workers that I'm going to twin into one. There's a question about whether it's not sensible to allow temporary foreign workers to come in and test the ground and figure out whether they like this country and can stay here. Does that not make sense? And then there's a question about the recent report from the Metcalf Foundation, authored by Faye Faraday, which recommends that all temporary foreign workers be given status on arrival. So two competing points of view, where do you see the future?
Okay, it's one of the problems is talking about temporary foreign workers as if they are a homogeneous group, and they are not. There are many temporary foreign workers who come to this country as a result of free trade agreements, or because they are accompanying their spouses, or for a variety of reasons, and that's sort of one category. There are others who are coming in at the high end, I say, to fill, high-skilled jobs that employers indicate they cannot find people here in Canada to do. There are also the lower-end temporary foreign worker jobs, whether they are for living caregivers who can transition to permanent residency, or seasonal agricultural workers who have a very prescribed program and must leave after no more than an 8-month period. And then this new group, which isn't so new anymore since 2002, of people being brought in specifically to fill low-skilled jobs, which may not be temporary at all, but for which employers are finding it difficult to find people here in Canada to fill. You really have to look at each of these differently to determine what makes sense, both in terms of policy terms and for the individuals. I am most concerned about the low-end folks because I think they are the ones with little opportunity to, or no opportunity to, transition to permanent residency, and for those who are tied to an individual permit with an individual employer and therefore are open to real exploitation. Those are the ones that I think are the most at risk and the most problematic, and my recommendation would be eliminate the low-skilled pilot program absolutely, definitively. Don't try to tweak it. Don't try to fix it. Just get rid of it. Economists are unanimous that bringing in people to fill those jobs is just a way to avoid employers dealing with the reality of maybe they're paying too little, maybe the working conditions aren't good enough, maybe they're not investing in training or in infrastructure, and it will depress wages and in the long term will not be good for our country. So I say eliminate that program. Therefore, and in terms of that second part of your question, I would grandparent those people who are here filling those low-skill jobs and allow them, if they meet certain criteria, to transition to permanent residency. But I would not maintain a program that continually brings in these people, makes them pay their due, be exploited, whatever, and the reward is permanent residency. I think that's a mistake in terms of the approach. In terms of the why not have people come here as temporary foreign workers and then decide what they want to do, I would really prefer for people to apply for permanent residency to come to Canada, come here with all their rights and all their abilities to contribute. We know that labor markets are very mobile these days. If they choose to leave, they may leave. If they choose to stay, they stay. But if they come here as permanent residents, they have more of a stake in terms of actually establishing roots here. They will come with their families. If they come here as temporary foreign workers, many of them leave their families back home. I don't think we should encourage a program that encourages family separation. Let them come with their families, let them make a go of it, and hopefully we will be welcoming enough that they will want to stay.
Thank you, Naomi. Janet Howard has a question.
Oh, one more thing to add to that question, sorry. There also is a way that if someone is applying to come here as permanent residency, but they have a job offer, for example, which is how temporary foreign workers would come here in the first place, why not allow them to come and transition to permanent residency after arrival so that they are in the permanent residency stream, they have their job offer, their employer does not have they come right away, and then
employers and their role in selecting future Canadians and their capacity and ability to do this work, especially as we know most of the growth in jobs comes from SMEs. The question is, has this model of employer role in selecting future citizens been successful anywhere else? Is this what Australia does, New Zealand does? Is this what the U.S. does?
Certainly there are visas set aside in the U.S. specifically for people who come first as temporary foreign workers on a particular visa and then have the opportunity after years to apply for permanent residency. So we're not the first country to introduce this. But if you look proportionately, the United States, they sort of are the reverse of us. Their primary numbers are family reunification, and the economic stream for the United States is much smaller than their family stream. So one of the problems of sort of picking and choosing from different countries is not looking at the whole aspect of the different countries' programs, and picking one aspect that looks interesting and applying it here in Canada in a system that may be very different. SMEs is a perennial question. We don't really know how to help SMEs do the work that they need to do, both to employ immigrants who are already here, who are underemployed or unemployed, or to assist them in recruiting people from overseas. My preference in terms of SMEs would be to really help them gain the capacity to recruit, attract, and retain people who are here, immigrants who are underemployed and unemployed, rather than encouraging them to go abroad to select temporary foreign workers.
Thank you. A question from Manitoba, Jimena Munoz, the Fairness Commission. Hello, Jimena. Is interested in your comment that PNP receives priority processing over federal skilled workers and that this is not such a positive thing. Can you unpack that statement a little?
Hi, Jimena. Manitoba has really been the leader in terms of provincial nominee programs, and they over the past number of years have received far more people immigrating to Manitoba under the PNP program than under the federal skilled worker program. And that might have been a result of the criteria being used for federal skilled workers and the lack of knowledge of people overseas about Manitoba as a really good destination to go to. There are all kinds of factors. My concern about giving priority processing to PNPs is it took away from, I mean, if you look at the immigration numbers coming to Canada, for the past number of years there's been a finite number of approximately 250,000 a year. And any increase in one area automatically means a decrease in the other area. And what happened for a number of years is that the PNPs were really taking off and outshadowing or significantly reducing the number of federal skilled workers that could come in. My concern about that is that you have a number of different provinces, all provinces with the exception of Quebec that has their own process, plus a territory, plus federal programs. Each of the PNPs has many subcomponents. So you had about 60 different PNP programs, plus the federal program that had also many different components, all vying for a limited number of spaces. This caused huge confusion among immigrants about how to proceed, how to come to Canada. And the PNPs were selecting a number of people without the human capital that is necessary to make them really adaptable and flexible for changing labor market conditions. And what happened was that those PNPs that were successful in the provinces that selected them stayed in those provinces, and those that were unsuccessful in those provinces moved to other provinces. And the provinces where they were moving to received people with very little human capital that didn't have the adaptability to enter into that second province's labor market. So I think that that is a problem, and I think that there should be some minimal national standards for provincial nominee programs that allows for that mobility and allows for that adaptability. And I think the federal move in this regard of introducing some basic language requirements is not a bad thing.
The new ideas are the currency of the day. There's this new idea about expression of interest. Nadia has a question as to whether you can unpack that a little for the audience.
Well, I wish I could, but the details have really not been determined. But I can tell you what I know so far. The federal government is considering an adaptation of a New Zealand model, which has also been adapted by Australia, that would allow for people interested in immigrating to Canada as an economic immigrant, and probably they will go first with federal skilled workers, but that's not yet been determined. But people interested in coming to Canada as an economic immigrant to go through a basic screen, probably similar to the selection criteria being proposed for the federal skilled worker program, the point system. If people pass that initial screen, they will be in an inventory. That inventory will be open to the federal government to look at, to provincial governments to look at, to potentially employers, maybe pre-screened employers to look at, to see who in that pool they might be interested in inviting to submit the second stage application to come to Canada. Those individuals will be given an invitation to formally apply, and then those individuals will go through the next processes. That's the broad basis of this initiative. We don't know exactly whether it'll just be for federal skilled workers or beyond. We don't know how it'll be implemented alongside a provincial nominee program, or whether ultimately it will replace a provincial nominee program. We don't know what the selection criteria, those preliminary criteria, will actually be, and we don't know how long that time, a matter of weeks, the way it is in New Zealand, or whether it'll be a matter of months or any combination thereof. So lots of unknowns.
Thank you. More announcements to look forward to, I understand. Here's a very interesting question about international students. And the question refers to the high, to the level of fees that international students have to pay, to the intention of the federal government to land them in Canada as permanent residents once their studies have been completed and under circumstances. And the question is, what's the real intention of the government here? Is it to increase enrollment in our universities so that universities are getting more fees, or is it to actually have students who studied in Canada who were able to pay the fees, or possibly from a fluent background, to stay in Canada?
I don't think it's an either or. international students, studies have been done to show the very substantial economic benefit that international students bring to Canada, both in terms of, their purchasing power, their living expenses, their tuition fees, as an example. They also enrich the university environment by bringing different experiences and different backgrounds. They also work in our labs. I mean, many of our labs and universities, particularly in the sciences, are peopled by international students, and some labs might go under if they didn't have international students. So I think universities and our society benefits, and our domestic students benefit from international students, even if they just are international students who come for the course of their study and then go home again. I think, though, the government has recognized, again, from all kinds of studies that have been done, that more and more people who want to immigrate to a particular country are using the international student stream as a way to achieve immigration in that country, and that some international students are making their educational decisions on the basis of whether ultimately it will be possible for them to immigrate and stay in that country. So the two are very, very closely related. They are not separate. Canada has recognized, as has Australia, has recognized this for many, many, many years, that international students can be a terrific pool of potential immigrants to Canada. If they are in a university setting and get a Canadian credential that's recognized in Canada that helps in their labor market integration. They've started their integration process. They have a head start on language acquisition. All of those things make them potentially really good immigrants. There are some problems, however. The first is that if you look at the figures, the significant increase in international students has not been at the university level, and it's not even been at the community college level. It's been to language schools and private training institutes. And we know, unfortunately, that many of those institutions can be a little shady. And we know that some students who have come here with all good intentions have not received a quality education. So to its credit, again, I think the federal government has indicated that the host institutions of international institutions should in fact be recognized so that there is some guarantee of an education being provided that is of high quality. Another issue is that international students who come here as temporary entrants are not eligible for federally funded services, and there's no requirement on the part of the educational institutions to provide those kinds of settlement and integration supports. So in some respects, people who come here as international students have a delayed integration because they don't have the access to some of the supports that other immigrants do have. Yes, they do pay additional hikes in tuition fees, but there's no requirement for those increased fees to go towards the provision of supports for them. So they may not be getting the supports that they need. The other thing that is very interesting to note is that as one of the ways to attract international students, the government has made it easier for students to work both on and off campus, both during their course of study and after their course of study. There has been a phenomenal increase in the number of work permits that students have received both during and, more importantly, post-graduation. And one questions, or could question, whether the increase is as a result of students wanting to work here as opposed to students wanting to either be educated here or to stay here.
Thank you, Naomi. There are so many questions, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to pose one last question. What is the one thing you'd like everyone to take away from this presentation?
Well, I think there's more than one thing. Okay, I think the complexity of all of this and you can easily become overwhelmed given all the changes. And I don't want the one thing to be for people to go away and say, I'm really overwhelmed. I do want them to go away and say, whoa, lots of stuff is happening that I need to find out more about. I want to read the paper. I want to come and find out more, and I want to understand more. I want to ask more questions. I want to become involved. I want to have the conversation. I want to influence my member of parliament. I want to influence my neighbors so they understand the enormity of these changes. And I guess this is, in some respects, if not a call for action, a call for discussion.
On that note, we're going to conclude this webinar. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question or would like to schedule one-to-one interviews, please contact our communications manager, whose details are on the left of the screen. You can also download the full report, and really there's nothing quite like reading the full report, by visiting our website, www.maytree.com/policy. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website shortly. Let me thank Naomi on all your behalf for a comprehensive overview with lots of details, putting it together. And thank you to my colleague Sandra Lopes of Maytree for managing this whole process. Have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.